Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for Issues and Answers Public Education. I'm Fred Martino. During the last few years, concerns over public education changes in New Mexico have reached a boiling point. Over the next hour, we'll have audience questions for a panel of experts as we look for answers to the many challenges facing our schools. But first, a few minutes of our recent documentary on public education in New Mexico from KRWG's Simon Thompson.
Jacqueline Sanchez says she handles testing better than many students, but she's concerned the focus on standardized testing may not prepare her for college work.
So I can't learn what I'm going to need in college, you know? I'm stuck learning stuff that is gonna, I don't know, make me pass this test.
We have a system that says, let's make sure we know where we stand so we can support our struggling teachers, get them closing those gaps they want to close with their kids, and let's make sure we champion our great educators.
But teachers in Las Cruces say it's not effective. An anonymous survey produced by the NEA, the National Education Association, found only 7% of Las Cruces public school teachers believed state-mandated assessments improved the quality of student work. The Public Education Department acknowledges the new system has some imperfections that need to be ironed out, but Governor Susana Martinez says it's superior to the old system. She claimed it found 99.9% of teachers to be proficient, a statistic disputed by the NEA. The Teachers Union says it asked for the proof behind the claim, but it was never provided by the PED.
Every professional is evaluated as to the performance of their job. And as a school teacher, it's important that we have good teachers in every classroom for every child.
With an increased emphasis on testing in the past decade, Deming Public Schools Superintendent Dr. Dan Lear says teachers are leaving more quickly than he can replace them.
And I'm not saying we're having a hard time hiring high-quality teachers. We're having a hard time hiring any kind of teacher. Okay, people just don't want to go into education because what they're hearing about what's going on, they're like, do I really want to do that?
Lear says his district is having a particularly difficult time recruiting teachers in special ed, math and bilingual education. And National Education Association Las Cruces President Parr-Sanchez says teachers in those high-demand areas are unfairly penalized by an evaluation system so heavily based on student test scores.
If you are a teacher of English language learners, or if you teach special needs students, guess what's going to happen to those test scores? They're not going to be as high. So how do you attract the best teachers to teach our students that are most in need? It's craziness.
And you can watch that entire documentary on the Newsmakers page in the television section at krwg.org. Joining us to discuss public education in New Mexico today, a very important topic for our state and our community, two longtime educators on my right, Senator Bill Soules, and National Education Association New Mexico Vice President Mary Parr-Sanchez. And on my left, from the Las Cruces School Board, student member Andre Gonzales, who suggested and helped organize today's program, School Board member Ed Frank, who spent decades teaching on the East Coast prior to moving to Las Cruces, and Joe Galvan, Communications Officer for the Las Cruces Public Schools. And full disclosure, I approach this show like any other as a journalist, but I do hold a doctorate in educational administration. Andre, I want to begin with you. Tell me why you came to me with the idea for this show today.
Yeah, so this was kind of an idea. It was right before spring break, kind of 2 a.m., and this idea just popped into my head. Why not have a public forum, a public discussion where we can talk about public education? This is definitely a topic that has gotten a lot of attention in the past few years, and especially this year, now that Las Cruces Public Schools has the Student Advisory Council, students are very, very invested and interested into what's happening in public education. So I figured, why not bring all the stakeholders together and let's have a good conversation.
Absolutely, and we should point out as well that we did invite the Public Education Department to provide a representative for today's forum, but we did not get a response. We want to welcome our audience members now to come forward with their questions for our panel. And as we wait, Mary, this week the Legislative Finance Committee released a study that showed students are losing about a third of instructional time, including a full 10 days to prepare for standardized tests. Tell me your reaction to this and this problem that has been occurring really over the last number of years, something that your union and a lot of others all over the nation really have been talking about.
Well, I think that it's important that we look at instructional time and how we're using that. We actually, in the new federal law, the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, one of the first things that we're able to do is work with the district to do an audit of the tests that we're giving and the time that we're investing in that. I noticed in that article as well, it had things like recess time and breakfast in the classroom, and those are some things that we really support because kids need to have recess. And recess was really being cut into for test preparation and for kids that were, misbehaving and that kind of thing. So we greatly support breakfast in the classroom. It's a wonderful thing, and so
I think the surprise, though, for folks who are not in the classroom, including me, was when I read about this, that 10 full days, 10 school days, so that's 2 weeks,
right,
is being spent just to prepare for these standardized tests. This was probably not a surprise to you.
No, it isn't a surprise, and really it's shocking, and we invest a lot of valuable class time where we used to be able to do things like hatching ducks and doing pumpkin math or some of the more creative type group projects. We invest a lot more time doing rote memorization and things to try to prepare kids because they are such high stakes and they really give us very little value back. Very little information is given back to us because we don't get the test results until much later. And as an 8th grade teacher for many years, those students that I tested would now be in 9th grade when I would get their test results back. They're really doing me no good whatsoever.
Okay.
So that's 10 days that doesn't give me anything I need to improve instruction.
All right, we do have a question from an audience member. Hello.
Hi, I'm Mike. I live here in Las Cruces and work with some kids in Anthony. I'm going to go to the money issue, specifically formula funding and capital outlay. We've had 2 primary sources of funding for the 89 school districts in the state, and everything from JAL to Albuquerque pretty much uses the same rules. My question to the panel, and Senator Bill Soules, thank you for being part of this. This is great. We're coming up a 60-day session. The buzz already is out there. Is there enough source for the monies needed? And is the administration of the monies fair in the long sense? And so the question goes to a legislator as well as the school. Is it enough? Is the way we do money business smart? And are there ways we could change it?
Okay, Senator Soules, let's begin with you on that.
No, we do not sufficiently fund our schools, and the state constitution requires that the legislature provide sufficient funding for the education of all the children in New Mexico. And approximately 8 years ago, there was a study done as to what does sufficient mean, and in current dollars, we underfund, according to that bipartisan panel, or nonpartisan, I should say, that we are underfunding education by about $360 million a year. What that does, and I think New Mexico has a wonderful formula for how we fund schools. That can always be changed and tweaked, but because we underfund the schools, what we have is shared poverty. and everybody doesn't have enough, and so many of the issues we deal with in education are due to not having enough money for the nature of education in New Mexico. We're a very rural state, and that requires higher costs for some of the very small, some of them called micro districts. We have high levels of poverty that requires additional cost to try and help those students reach higher levels. Most of the problems we have ultimately come down to we can't begin to start talking about appropriate solutions if we don't talk about appropriately or sufficiently funding our schools.
And, you know, as part of that, we heard in the beginning video that school districts are having difficulty in New Mexico attracting teachers. One of the things that the documentary gets deeper into is that this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem, not only because of the controversy over working in education, the difficulties that teachers are facing in particular, but the reality being that money-wise, we're falling further and further behind. Mary, I know this is a major issue for you, that in Las Cruces Public Schools, the starting pay for teachers when they start is $34,000 a year. Just down the road in El Paso Independent School District, it's $44,000 a year. So we're talking about a very big difference in starting pay for teachers.
Yes, and I think it's not only the starting pay, and that is a huge part of it, but it's also that you ultimately are not going to progress down the salary or up the salary ladder either. I mean, you don't get far from $34,000 after 26 years and 30 years in the district. You're not too much further down the path. So it is extremely difficult. And then you couple that with what people are hearing about the top-down mandates and the loss of any kind of autonomy. And you have a situation where people are not going into education. And I would really like to talk to people, anybody that's watching that might be considering that it really is a very rewarding experience to be a classroom teacher, and that we really do, I believe that the people on this panel are going to make things better, and for those that come after us.
Okay. We have another question from another audience member. Hello.
Hi, my name is Sylvia Garcia, and I'm an interventionist with the Las Cruces School District. And budgets are very important in the school system. And I want to ask everybody on the panel, should the process be made public of how these budgets are made, especially in our district, because there's major cuts in teachers throughout the district as we speak. There's lots of teachers losing their jobs. And so I would like to know, should that process of how a budget is created for the district be made public?
Okay, so transparency, a big issue anytime we're talking about public business. Joe Galvan, I want to start with you on that and your comments for the district on the transparency of the budget process.
Certainly. I think it's critically important that it is a transparent process. And I think teachers want and deserve more information, and not just teachers, every employee. We're a huge employer in this community. We have over 3,200 staff members. We've had about 6 meetings so far on our budget, and we need to continue to open up that dialogue and let people know what is our funding, how much less do we have this year, and what are we expecting for next school year, and then help us solve that being in the red. What do we do in order to have an achieve balanced budget? And the school board has to listen to both parties, so I totally agree the process should be open. And just to make sure everyone realizes, we haven't cut anybody. So.
Okay. Ed, let me ask you about this as a school board member, about your thoughts on transparency, and also in terms of your ability as a school board member to react to some of these issues. We know that in Las Cruces in particular, there has been some intervention by the public education department, which has actually caused changes in board decisions.
Well, I mean, the school board, we recently revised our budget development process, okay, to make the whole process more transparent and to solicit input from all of the stakeholders in the system. And that's why I'm really upset about tomorrow when we have a budget meeting and apparently the doors are being closed to people, and I don't understand why. As to your other question about I don't really believe that anything that the PED has done has really affected any of our decisions.
Well, I was referring in particular, and our documentary covers this, to the fact that the school board did not want the district to provide information about the leave that teachers were taking to the PED, which could be used against them in their evaluations. But the PED came back to the school board and said, you must do this. You don't have a choice. We are going to use contractually negotiated leave as part of the teacher evaluation, whether you like it or not, basically.
Well, that was pretty upsetting that we were overruled on that issue. You know, I mean, I think we all still believe that we did the right thing, but we had no choice but to comply. So that's what we did.
Yes, and it's, if I could jump in, it's an anti-family position that the public ed department is taking, because many of the employees of Las Cruces Public Schools are also parents, and it is very anti-family that you cannot take care of a sick child or a sick parent. And in Las Cruces Public Schools, we have negotiated in our agreement that teachers and other employees will get 10 sick days per year, which I think is pretty standard. I mean, I think even the public ed department allows their employees to take or have the option to take 10 sick days. So we're not asking for anything that they don't do themselves for their own employees.
Right, and as you know, the PED's response was, well, if an employee applies for the Family Medical Leave Act, they can take those leave days without being penalized. But of course, not all sicknesses or other issues would involve an FMLA application. Bill, give me your reaction to that issue, because this really, while it dealt specifically with teachers, it sets a precedent for the state of New Mexico, and that precedent, as you know, critics would say, is very dangerous in the idea that you can have a contract for a benefit, but then be told, we will, if you use the benefit, we will use it against you in your evaluation.
And for those exact reasons, I would have some real concerns about it. I also think that those kinds of decisions, that's why we have locally elected school boards. Locally elected school boards understand and know the local community and what's best for the teachers within that community. And the school and the union, the NEA, have bargained in good faith for those particular benefits. And for someone else to come and say, no, you can't do that, or that's going to affect your evaluation if you do it after the fact, I think really belittles the whole process of trying to keep education and education policy as close to the students as possible, which is what happens with local boards, local districts, and having the government from up above come in afterwards and say, no, you did it wrong, I think really belittles that whole process.
And as a point of disclosure, we should mention you were a teacher for many years in Las Cruces
I was a teacher,
Public
and I
Schools.
was 8 years on the school board as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Fred, if I may really quickly,
yes.
Going back to the original question about whether budgets should be transparent, I really do believe that. You know, this year the Student Advisory Council did get to provide input on the budget very early on in the process. However, you know, I think it's very, very important that we have a dialogue on the transparency of the budget process, and also about how the budget is created at the state level as well. You know, one of the things that one of my fellow delegates with the Senate Youth Program said is that if we are able to pay millions and millions of dollars for tests to hand out these tests, then we should be able to also treat our teachers with respect. And so that's why I think we need to have transparent budgets.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we do have another question.
Hi folks, I'm Dave. And obviously from the documentary clip and from the discussion so far, there's a lot of challenges that we're facing in education. But I was wondering if we could talk about some of the bright spots. Are there any sort of bright spots that we see locally? And are there any maybe alternatives to this model of high stakes testing that we're seeing?
Well, Yes, as a matter of fact, we are really excited to be participating, working very closely with the district and with our community in it's a community schools project. And more so than really a project, it's based on years and years of research of how other school districts have successfully been able to make some real differences and changes in children's lives, and recognizing and not silencing a teacher, because many teachers will say the reason that this child may or may not do well on this test is because they have some challenging conditions that they're experiencing at home. And we've been kind of silenced about that as well, because we've been told that we're making excuses for kids and for what we should be able to do. But research shows, and I don't have to tell you or anybody that reads, that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that what happens in a child's life greatly impacts their ability to do well on a standardized test.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we actually have a few graphics that deal with this very issue. And, not just in New Mexico, but all over the country, we often hear statistics mentioned about other countries. Finland is one country that's mentioned a lot. It really isn't a good comparison to the United States at all, because it's a very small country with a very low poverty rate. But in USA Today a few years ago, Oliver Thomas, who is the president of the Great Schools Partnership, wrote about Finland. He said, here's one data point worth remembering. When you measure the test scores of American schools with a child poverty rate of less than 20%, our kids not only outperform the Finns, they outperform every nation in the world. He follows up. 2 new studies on education and poverty were reported in Education Week in October. This is 2013. The first, from the Southern Education Foundation, reveals that nearly half of all U.S. public school students live in poverty. Taking a look at that second study, it was conducted by the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. It reveals that poverty, not race, ethnicity, national origin, or where you attend school, poverty is the best predictor of college attendance and completion. So the issues of poverty actually follow on beyond K-12 into the issue of college completion as well. Andre, as a student, but also as a student member of the school board, do you think, and you've had a chance to go through a lot of school board meetings now, and by the way, speak at the school board meetings. I'm told you speak quite eloquently at the meetings. Do you think that government and the media are doing enough to talk about the issues of poverty in terms of education?
I think it's a very, very complex issue when trying to cover it. Oftentimes, you don't know whether a student is living in poverty. You don't know that student's background. However, I think that it is up to the school district, it is up to schools, it is up to teachers to help identify those students who are at risk, who are living in poverty, and try to provide those services to them. I applaud the efforts being made for community schools, because they are providing the services that will help ensure that students can do the absolute best
to address those issues.
Yes.
Ed, is it frustrating to you as a school board member, the focus, it seems, at the state level, and really this started at the national level, is on schools and teachers. But education, as Andre points out, is much more complicated than that, and poverty is a big part of it.
Right. So I think, what we need to do, we can't do much about poverty, but we can deal with the consequences of it in the schools. I think we need early childhood education really desperately, as early as possible. And for kids that are poor, we need after-school programs. And we also need, in the lower grades, we need really much smaller classes so that we can address individual needs and deal with them before they become big problems. Mm-hmm. I think that's how we can turn the tide against poverty. I think the way out of poverty is through education, and we need to have the programs in our schools that will do that.
Okay. We do have another audience question.
My name is Liz Rodriguez Johnson, and I'm chair of the Democratic Party of Doña Ana County. Your first question dealt with issues relative to testing, over-testing being the biggest. What are the solutions, legislative and otherwise?
Okay. Mary, I want to begin with you on that. One of the things that people will see if they watch the documentary is that testing, a lot of teachers say, is crowding out a lot of other things that teachers need to do in the classroom. They also say in the documentary that it's sometimes a very poor judge of very important skills that students need, especially if they're going to go to college. One of the big highlights in the documentary for me, as someone who's taught college classes, is that teachers say, you know, how the heck can we judge writing based on a timed test graded by someone other than their teacher, when in fact writing, a big part of writing is revision, and it's developing deep thoughts about issues. It's learning how to think, not just learning how to write.
Absolutely. Education really is it should be a very organic process. You should have standards and benchmarks from which you operate within. But other than that, I think that's all that needs to be said. And then the assessment piece and the learning piece need to be left up to the practitioner, the person that is the professional, because the best education is education that is local, you know, and the more local we can make it, culturally relevant education. Finding where a kid is inspired, you know, creativity, inspiration. We don't do it that way now. We have this measurement and everything goes to the measurement, when really we need to look at the child and say, what is this kid excited about? You know, what would make that child want to pick up a book? What topic, or what would make them want to write about something? What would make them excited enough, curious enough that they would be inspired to do that? And for every child, there is something. I know that from my 25 years in the classroom. You can always find something that a child is interested in, and it isn't rocket science. I mean, it's just the person who's working with that child, looking in their eyes. That is the person that should be assessing that child's progress, that child's writing. We don't need to spend, like Andre referenced, a lot of money to do that, because that is what we train to do, is to create lessons, to create an environment where that child can grow and learn at a rate appropriate for that child.
Bill, this is also, of course, a legislative issue. The legislature has passed a number of measures to try to address many of the complaints of teachers and parents and students. Some of that legislation has been vetoed. I want to ask you specifically, because the question was about testing, about one of the most controversial things, which we do focus on in the documentary, which is that for many teachers, 50% of their evaluation is based on test scores, which is not a mandate by any means. In some states, I believe, have gone as low as 20%. For the evaluation. Your thoughts on that, and do you think there'll be any change now that we have further loosening of federal issues with the Every Student Succeeds Act?
First, and that's a great question. There are several lawsuits still pending in the state of New Mexico over the teacher evaluation model that's being used. And I think what's trying to be done is they're trying to quantify teaching with very specific numbers, and on a test using things that are easy to measure, not necessarily what's most important to measure. And if you look at who the really good teachers, and the people to ask about who the good teachers are their students. Most students will tell you who their good teachers are, and they're not the ones that give them A's. They're not the ones that give them parties on Fridays. They're the ones that inspire them for a future. And if you look at those particular students, the teachers don't necessarily have the best test scores out of it, but the students are excited to learn more about that topic. And one of the stories that I tell would be about two math teachers, one who their students sit in rows, they're quiet, they learn all of the math, they do great on the test, but they hate math and never want to take another math class. Or the teacher, students may not score as well, but they feel capable of doing math. They feel they can take it on, they can challenge it, and they want to take additional math. I would think the second teacher is a much better teacher than the one that got high test scores and students hate the subject. And the tests don't test that. They don't test where a teacher provides a role model for them, gets them excited, makes them believe in themselves, because that's difficult to measure on a standardized test. But we can sure tell whether you got that math problem right or not.
Okay.
I think we missed the point.
We are going to be getting to another audience question in just a moment. We have a gentleman who's patiently waiting. But first, a reminder that despite the challenges, teachers in New Mexico are making an enormous difference in students' lives every day, including first grade teacher Debbie Romero, a KRWG American Graduate Champion.
I'm the oldest in a family of 4, and so I've kind of grown up being a teacher. So I was in an education type role doing business management. My husband said, "Well, what have you always wanted to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I'm pretty much happy what I'm doing." And he said, "Have you thought of education?" He said, "You do that all day anyway." And I'm like, "Oh, that would be great." We start the day with a song and I sing to them.
Did Pete cry?
Goodness, no!
He kept walking along and singing his song.
And if I forget to sing it, they'll remind me, "Miss Romero, you didn't sing us our song today." I'll say, "Oh, I forgot." You know, I'm the facilitator. I'm here to help each one of these kids to grow in independence, in confidence, in satisfaction, and in academics. But you notice I mentioned academics last, because if the other things are in place, their confidence is going to be there and the other will come naturally, which I think it needs to be more natural instead of hammered into everybody. My philosophy of education is that every child is gifted. We just have to find where that gift lies.
So eloquently put there that it's so important that our students have the confidence, and that when we give them that confidence with great teachers, great education, they can do amazing things. And we have such wonderful teachers. We're going to have another American Graduate Champion coming up. Right now I have a question from another audience member. Sir, thank you for your question.
You bet. Dr. A. Barmendaris, Professor Emeritus at MSU and currently Principal of Anthony Charter School. Before I preface my questions, I'd like to respond to Mr. Frank's comment about we need more after-school programs. My question is, why after school? We need them during the school, not after. When the kids are tired, the teachers are tired, everybody's tired, we need those same programs that we feel are going to benefit our kids after school, taught during school.
All right, well, before you get to your question, let me allow Ed to respond to that, because I think, Ed, if I understood you correctly, you weren't saying that there was any issue with providing more resources during the day, but that there was a need for after-school programs to supplement some of what's happening,
That's
right?
correct, yes. Yes, I mean, I just think it's much better for these kids to be involved in a supervised activity after school, someplace where they can get help with their homework, where they can, become inspired to love learning and be curious and creative.
Yeah, and actually we're going to, coming up, get to some research which talks about the incredible value of additional programs like after-school programs in helping students, particularly students who are facing poverty. Now your question, sir.
Okay, and I'm hoping that this is not the case here tonight, but I've been in education for 44 years, and most of what we've done has been talk about issues in education, and we feel education is still in the same boat that it's been for many years. I was observing one of my teachers at Anthony Charter School, and he had a slide of when schools came into being in New Mexico, and one of the governors, his goal, his objective was to improve schools in New Mexico. And it seems to me like we're still talking about that in 2016. But my questions are basically, to Senator Souls is, what is the state, with a shortage of SPED teachers and bilingual education teachers, is there a movement, is there something that's being done by the legislature to address this issue so we can have more certified special ed and bilingual teachers? And then to the public school people, are the public schools doing something to address and remedy the same situation, the shortage of bilingual and special ed teachers?
Okay, Bill, let's begin with you on that.
Sure, and again, very good question that gets right to the heart of some of the problems that we have in education right now. I think the legislature is very aware of it, but many times the proposals that have been coming through on how to address the teacher shortage has been by putting people who are unqualified into the classroom because you need somebody and there aren't any people going into that. I don't think we've addressed the actual issues which have to do with working conditions, that have to do with the pay. And New Mexico State has for years been produced lots and lots of bilingual teachers, but they get bought, as you indicated earlier, by Texas for substantially more, California, other states that pay large signing bonuses, have better working conditions. Trying to keep them in New Mexico with our low pay and low morale currently, we're not able to compete with those.
And Joe Galvan, this is a major problem, I understand, for Las Cruces public schools, recruiting more bilingual teachers and special ed teachers.
Very difficult. We go all over the country looking for teachers, hopefully that they will sign on, that they want to come to a beautiful place to live, but they're not going to be getting the big bonus that they could in another state. So it's very difficult. And I think the root of the problem really stems back to how much money are we putting into public education in our state. It used to be about half of the budget for the state of New Mexico. It's a lot less than that now. And I don't blame Senator Souls at all. He's been one of our champions. But until we raise the amount of money back to the 50% mark, we're going to continue to be on the short end of trying to be able to hire good people and get those specialized positions like bilingual endorsed teachers.
Okay, and I want to look at some research now because it relates, the need for funding relates to this research, particularly in a state like New Mexico, which is one of the poorest in the country. This comes from Helen Ladd of the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy. The first slide gives us some statistics. We can really put our hands around this. 40% of the variation in reading scores and 46% of the variation in math scores is associated with variation across states in child poverty rates. Very important to understand this, that this is, and here's why. Poor health, limited access to home environments with rich language and experiences, low birth weight, limited access to high-quality preschool opportunities, less participation in many activities in the summer and after school. We heard that earlier. Then middle-class families often take for granted, and more movement in and out of schools because of the way the housing market operates for low-income families. And we have one more slide. Again, this is all from Helen Ladd of the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy. Charter schools that have beaten the odds typically have significant extra funding from philanthropic sources that permit them to do things that have not generally been viewed as feasible within the traditional public schools, such as offering longer school days, Saturday classes, and a longer school year, and requiring teachers to teach longer hours. So this gets to this very issue that we've been talking about funding in our public schools, and why this is such an important issue, particularly in New Mexico. Bill, we have unfortunately though now have an additional challenge in that revenue is down in the state of New Mexico. In fact, just this week, I'm sure you saw, We're not even taking in as much tax revenue as we were the previous year. Part of this is the oil prices being down, but it may go deeper than that as well. We're not in the economic recovery in the state that we're seeing in other states around the nation.
I think you're exactly right, and it's part of New Mexico does have poverty, but we also make choices as to where we invest the money that we do have. And those choices over the last many years, when I first got into public education, as Joe Galvan indicated, about 50% of the state budget was spent on public school education. It's now about 43%. And people will talk about the actual dollars are higher, but inflation has eaten all of that away. And our actually commitment to public school education has gone down in the state of New Mexico. And I see public education and also higher education as an investment in our future, not as a cost we have now. And if we really think that public education matters, we need to start making those investments. We also have talked a lot about poverty. And poverty is often being blamed on the schools by the low test scores, but we as society have to own that because the kids don't choose to live in poverty, and the schools are what are trying to make the difference. But if we don't deal with the problem as society, the schools don't have the resources to do it without everyone else helping.
Right, and we can't do it in isolation of other agencies that are also state funded. For example, one of the things that wasn't mentioned in the study, but I see every day in my job as a truancy person that I do home visits with families, is we have a horrible issue with mental health problems affecting our parents, affecting our students. And we have a crisis of mental health delivery system in this state because of actions taken by our governor to halt Medicaid payments to 15 agencies that were accused of fraud that was never proven, and in fact it was proven just the opposite, that there was no fraud, and that's going to take years for the state to recover from that, and we don't have the time to do that. So we also have a high incarceration rate. Many of our parents are poverty breeds a lot of other ills.
You probably saw the study that came out recently that 10% of New Mexico children have had a parent incarcerated. 1 in 10.
Yes, and the 100% of the boys, it was on the front page of the Albuquerque Journal, they did a study, a pediatrician in Albuquerque, that 100% had more, they had 6 or more indicators of these adverse childhood experiences, which was more than double what other states across the country have had. So childhood trauma is a very significant factor, and we need to really move on addressing childhood trauma and being able to deal with it in the classroom, or we're going to lose a whole generation of kids. I mean, we need to start addressing it now.
Take it very seriously. We have another question.
I'm Dr. Emma Armendariz. I have been retired for 5 years from Las Cruces Public Schools. I did 48 years in education. So believe it or not, I've seen everything, and I get very sad recently because I still have a lot of connections with teachers. And one of the issues that keeps being brought up, which touches on the poverty issue as well as many of the other issues you've already discussed, is the fact that during testing time, as an example, which was recently happening, so many of the schools were not appropriately equipped to deal with the testing on computers. And they said, they kept breaking down. We didn't have support. We didn't have IT support at every school, to take care of the matter immediately. A lot of times the testing had to stop and then get started all over again. Are any of you aware that those things are happening? I'm sure you are, but is there anything that's being done, to address that? Because I'm sure that those conditions affect the results of the tests.
Well, first, let me go to Joe Galvan on that. For Las Cruces Public Schools, was technology an issue in terms of testing?
Technology was a big issue, particularly last year. We had a lot more laptops being used, but this year it was noticeably improved. But there's always a technology issue. We have a staff of technology technicians, but that's another place where it's just not quite have enough people.
Yeah.
But I have to admit that it was much better this year, but there's no doubt that technology is a technical issue
Yeah.
during testing to get everything to work just
Well,
right.
and of course it's also a learning issue because a student who may have a computer in the house, uses computers a lot, may have a leg up over other students as
Right.
well. We have a student, so we have firsthand knowledge. Tell me about the experience.
I mean, as we've transitioned to the PARCC testing, last year there was definitely issues when we were trying to figure out how some students were taking exams on iPads, some were taking exams on laptops, and it created a really big issue, especially for English exams where you're having to type stuff out.
Yeah.
A lot of students weren't used to that. This year, there were still issues. Every single class where I've taken where I've taken an EOC, a states end of course exam, we've had issues there, and students they spend 40 minutes on an essay for this English EOC, and then they get kicked out of the system. And they're forced to start all over again. They're forced to sit there and sit through the exam all over again. One of the things that the Student Advisory Council advocated for this year in our budget request, our budget initiatives, was to further support those IT staff and increase their numbers so that these issues can be tackled. But, you know, there's only so much you can do in terms of ensuring that you have the best equipment before you can start questioning whether the test itself is well created.
Yeah.
Well,
And
Fred,
that-
you can't live without it, but you can't live with it, or is it the other way
Yeah.
around?
Yeah.
You know, we have to have it, but, you know, we have to be able to support it.
Yeah,
So it is
exactly.
an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, well, I just can't imagine for the students if they ever had to start over
Yeah.
testing, but we've heard this in other states as well, where there have been technical problems, and there's already such a high stress level.
It's a definite issue. Students, they go in there stressed. And for me, I mean, I've gotten used to the tests. It's kind of, and it's something that's sad, really. When I was talking with friends, it was kind of like, well, you know, mid-April comes around and school is done because
Yeah.
we go into testing mode. That's not okay. We still have a month and a half of school to go, but we're sent into this testing mode.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but it is definitely an issue.
Okay, well, we're going to get to more questions coming up, but first, another KRWG American Graduate Champion. He is a Mayfield High educator, a Las Cruces Teacher of the Year, and was later named Teacher of the Year in New Mexico. Here is New Mexico State University alum David Morales.
I tell people I'm a teacher, they kind of cringe a little bit and then when I tell them I'm a high school teacher, they're no, I could never do that, or no, they're scary, and they're great people, they're great kids. And going in with that attitude, you see that a lot of the kids respond to that and they want to give you their best. I currently teach New Mexico history as part of the social studies and history department, and I'm also the Enlace teacher. Enlace stands for Engaging Latino Communities for Education, and it's part of a statewide collaborative. 2 years ago, I wanted to leave. I was done. I was tired, I was angry with the political climate, with everything around teaching. And I got asked to read names at graduation, and I saw my kids walk across the stage, and that's it. After that, I told my wife they're gonna have to take me out kicking and screaming. I go, I'm gonna do the best I can. And last year I was lucky enough and blessed enough to win the Teacher of the Year. And it was a testament to my children, my kiddos, my students, and the teachers I work with, the administration I worked for. You know, I came back and I focused on them. And I figured if I do right by them, I'm gonna be okay. And now it's all about them.
It was so great to be able to do those features, and KRWG honored those educators and others at a banquet that we had, a recognition event, and it was a great opportunity. I know a number of the folks in this room were able to go to that event, and it was really nice. But one of the things that really stood out to me about that particular segment was here you have Las Cruces Teacher of the Year, later New Mexico Teacher of the Year, and he says in the interview that we did with him, he was ready to quit. And this should be the kind of warning to our state about the kind of pressures that are happening in our schools, and it's one of the reasons that we're doing this show today, and that over the last 3 or 4 years we've covered education as much as we have. We've had many of you at home tell us this is an important issue, this is something you need to do, because 90 seconds on a newscast won't do it. It's something that needs time, and that's why we're doing this today. We have another audience member with a question.
Thanks. I'm going to do a bridge real quick, and I want it to start and be centered on the youth voice, but increasingly in the classrooms and external to the classrooms, there is a dependency on access to internet, Wi-Fi, to be able to do your homework, much less to be able to take some classes. DACC has an incredible listing of online courses. The point I want to make is that in 1990, when parents began to get engaged in their kids' education, there was no internet as we know it now. And here we are, almost totally dependent in some form of the education on the internet. And I'm going to address my question to Andre, and I'm going to remind all of us that we're talking 3 school districts in Doña Ana County. And somewhere in here, we've got a youth voice, and I got to tell you, they hammer me every week. But there's a youth voice that's saying, can't the educators, can't the school districts do something to either give us more access or to give us classes, change the curriculum so that we can get it all done in school? And I just have to believe that the answer is in the youth voice somewhere, with all of the guys who are running the money and the curriculum. We got to make a bridge. There's got to be a bridge there, and we got to find it fast. Andre, what's your 2 cents?
You know, within the past years, we have seen a very strong push towards online education. The district, we have the Virtual Learning Academy, and I've taken classes from that Learning Academy. However, you know, in New Mexico, I think the figure is something like 1/3 of families do not have access to internet at home. There was actually a news article that covered in Hatch, where students were going to the local Pickwick, going to the local gas station, going to the parking lots of different establishments that had free Wi-Fi so that they could turn in their work. Now, I'm completely for ensuring that students are able to go outside the classroom and be able to utilize those resources. However, it does have to be realized that if it's expected for students to use those resources, the resources have to be available in the first place.
Yeah.
Especially outside of Las Cruces, in the rural communities, this is a definite issue. And I cannot stress enough that the resources have to be made available so that those students can succeed in those classes.
Mary, as a teacher, another side to this that I wonder if you could comment on for me, are you concerned as well about another aspect of this growth in technology, that there's an attempt to replace classroom instruction?
Sure. I think technology is a beautiful thing, but I think it's only as good as the teacher that is using it, because critical thinking, you can put kids have a lot of computer time, a lot of time on their phones. In fact, their phones are connected to their bodies now, and you can't physically take their phone away. But the time to discuss and to work together with people, to think critically, those are things that they're not going to necessarily learn on a computer, but that they could learn in class. So,
and it really can change the whole dynamic, can't it? I mean,
Yes.
in my most recent graduate program, I noticed this because I was in a blended learning in some of the classes, and discussion boards online were used to replace classroom discussion, and it's a totally different dynamic. I mean,
Yes.
people will write nice things, and they will respond to each other, but when you're in a room together, you have a different kind of exchange, and you build upon one another.
Correct. Yes, I think it's a tool. Technology should be a tool that a great teacher can use. I do not think it is something that needs to be present all the time. It's
Okay.
I think it's a myth that we need to have students plugged in all the time. Reading requires their focus and their attention. They should not be listening to music. And yet, many kids insist that the only way they can read is to listen to music. And so it's interesting because we're having a really interesting time negotiating that space with kids because they are very attached to their technology, and it is a question that is going to keep resurfacing. How much technology is a good amount, and what kinds of technology, and what about the kids that don't have access? There's also a lot of research that shows that kids that do not spend a lot of time on computers, it further lowers their test score. Okay, so it's another indicator, a poverty indicator of your ability to perform. Kids that are very familiar with the computer and the tools of a computer score higher. The computer helps them to score higher. Kids that do not have that exposure, it's a further degradation of their scores. So there's a lot of factors.
We're quickly running out of time, and I want to get back to Ed Frank. Ed, as you know, there is a new federal law, the Every Student Succeeds Act. This really loosens things up for states and localities, the intention being to return more local control to our schools. What do you want to see from the state of New Mexico in regard to allowing you to do your job as a school board member?
Well, the new law is it gives the power over to the state, and unfortunately, in our state, that's not going to produce much change in terms of education. So I think there's hope. I think maybe we can replace who's running our state in the future and have a more enlightened governor and secretary of education who will return the autonomy to the local school districts. I think that's our really big hope.
And we should mention again for folks who are joining us late that we did invite the Public Education Department to provide a representative today, but we did not hear back.
Fred, if I can add to that.
Very quickly, yes.
Ever since December, I've been calling to have some type of dialogue with the Public Education Department on public education with students, to have a community discussion with, if not the Secretary of Education, then still at least someone. And time after time, they have not responded to these requests, and so I'm going to renew that request.
And we also put in a request following your requests. Final word on this, 10 seconds from each of you, not much time.
My final word, I would love to talk about the Community Schools Initiative that is very positive.
So hope for the future.
It's hope for the future because it's really going to bring the communities into the schools. We're not going to just rely on the resources of the school, but the resources of the community.
Bill.
We need to make long-term investments in our education as a way out of our economic doldrums right now, and we're not going to do that by cutting education at either the higher ed or K-12.
I liked your statement earlier. It's not a cost, it's an investment. That is Issues and Answers, Public Education. Thanks to our panel and our audience, and thanks to you at home for making in-depth journalism possible with your donations. Speaking of investments, you can become a member or renew your membership anytime online at krwg.org. I'm Fred Martino. For all of us at KRWG, have a great week.